Maybe if I can turn to Derek and just also to set the context and the history. Derek, what would your view be on the efficacy of MPOWER as an accelerator of tobacco control as we now look at reset as a potential accelerator of tobacco harm reduction? What are your views on MPOWER?
Thanks, Dylan. Well, I think we've got to remember that MPOWER was introduced by Bloomberg Philanthropies, not by WHO initially, as a means to try and codify and take the Framework Convention and simplify it down to a number of elements, and they came up with 6. And there lies the first problem. The oversimplification misses the need for an integrated approach. It totally ignores one of the most crucial things in tobacco control, funding it. All the financial provisions of the Framework Convention were scrapped. Secondly, it ignores completely the research and development components, which have yet to be activated by WHO. Thirdly, it ignores the success that will come and how it's going to impact on farmers. And finally, and most crucially, the elements that are in are not really able to be evaluated in terms of impact. They list mainly activities. So for example, when you read the reports, you'll talk about how many people are covered by law Y, X, Y, and Z. I have no idea what it means to be covered by a law. The question is it implemented, yes or no?
Yes, exactly.
And most of the important provisions, particularly 2, taxation and cessation, by their own records, are way below where they should be in the sort of 20% mark by countries. So I would say overall, the crude effort to simplify was not a good idea. Second of all, they haven't put the energy behind ensuring the measures have impact. And for that, they need to think about how you adapt the lofty provisions of words that have been developed in Geneva, ideally for a country with a very sophisticated legal enforcement capacity, and apply that into the complex developing countries of India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya, where the regulatory capacity is much weaker. So I would say that it's not surprising that we still have over 1 billion smokers in the world when you look at the non-specificity and vagueness of MPOWER.
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So let me comment on the reset idea, which I think is a good counterweight to at least start a discussion, and maybe just 4 comments. I do think one needs to think about the issue of disinformation and misinformation as it's mentioned, not as a footnote, but it needs to be an active part of the program. The level of disinformation, and I use the word disinformation as being information deliberately designed to confuse the public and confuse consumers. And we know that when it comes to just one measure, what percentage of people, doctors, and the public believe that nicotine is the primary cause of cancer caused by cigarettes? The figures, as determined by surveys over the last 3-4 years by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, have shown a worsening of the percentage of people who believe that nicotine is the primary cause of cancer. Other studies that have come out among doctors in India and doctors in America show that close to 60-70% of doctors believe that nicotine is the primary cause of cancer caused by cigarettes. All of this is profoundly wrong. And I think if reset is going to have impact, you have to reset the basis of knowledge, particularly starting with doctors, dentists, and nurses. Some other elements I think are important. When I think about risk-based proportionate regulation, I think about the successes we've seen in the world of other dirty legacy industries, the way governments act to make it easier for the desired new products to be used by consumers. So if you want them to buy, switch to solar, you make that cheaper, you make it more effective, you have the regulatory environment in its favor. If you want people to move out of the internal combustion engine, you make the manufacturer's ability to actually produce electric cars easier, and you make it easier for consumers to have access to places to plug their cars in. And so you could go on. The history of creating a mixture between the regulatory approach and an incentive to industry to move in that direction, and one that the consumer demands, is kind of common. And I think what you're talking about here is exactly what we need. Clearly, there needs to be a good differentiation by many categories between a combustible cigarette and a toxic smokeless cigarette and the reduced risk products, the full range, e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, snus, and nicotine pouches. And the elements, some of them are under risk proportionate, and I see some are under traceability. Number one is tax and price. Clearly, there has to be a price incentive, or at least a price neutral solution for people to move from a combustible cigarette to these products. And that can be achieved in many ways, by the manufacturer, through the excise tax policy, and so on. Second, there needs to be a communication differential. Clearly, the message of cigarettes kill doesn't apply to an e-cigarette or to snus. In fact, if you're using snus and you're sitting in parts of India with a toxic smokeless product, your life will be saved from oral cancer. Very different messaging is needed. Thirdly, we need to look at flavors. Flavors clearly are used by many smokers as a means of getting out of their combustible tobacco cigarette. They want to get away from the tobacco flavor, and they're looking as adults for something different, whether it's menthol or whatever it is. The differentiation on the basis of flavors is therefore also a crucial element. And the last one I'd say, which hopefully will not be happening too soon, but eventually we'll get there, is going to be differentiation in terms of the level of nicotine. And while the long-term discourse on lowering nicotine in combustible cigarettes is just warming up, that cannot happen unless there are levels of nicotine to allow the current smoker to move on to a nicotine level that would be suitable for them, that is no longer toxic. I think the safety point is taken very strongly. And I think it is amazing that we don't actually have acknowledged safety standards. I think if this effort is able to galvanize the major regulatory bodies to define these, I think the countries that are looking at how you regulate and are starting to, all the way from China to the US, to the UK, to New Zealand, to Guatemala, I think you'd be doing them a great service. And I think hopefully in time, WHO would also weigh in. I think ultimately, one of the issues under safety will also be the source of nicotine itself. And I can see the day coming when we will no longer tolerate the use of tobacco-derived nicotine in favor of synthetic nicotine, knowing that you can reduce and remove the contaminants far easier by not starting with them in the first place. And then finally, on traceability, I was really pleased to see that as an element. And I think we'll learn what it's about. But if we had traceability elements in place during the so-called EVALI pandemic of 2019, we would have known pretty rapidly it had nothing to do with these cigarettes and was entirely due to contaminated THC cartridges. And again, saying where do they come from requires traceability. So I think this is a very good discussion area, not just for discussion, but I think it provides a tool to talk to regulators and to inform the public about, so that they can see this truly could help them address how they actually get out of smoking.